For me, Shadow of the Erdtree was a satisfying journey that added more to an already incredible story, adding new details to the existing lore, whilst also detailing new characters and cultures. But most importantly, it heightened the stakes of the dynastic struggle that is the core to our journey in the base game. As a would-be lord, we culminate this DLC in a battle of Lord versus Lord. The Lord of the Old Order versus the Lord of a New Order. Shadow of the Erdtree exposes us to many different story points in our journey. The story of the Hornsent, the story of Messmer and how he was sent here to eradicate a previous culture. And finally, of course, we have the story of Miquella, the would-be god, a character whose imprint was felt so strongly in the main game, yet we never met him. And now we have his story coming full circle. And to wrap it all up, we have of course Marika's story, getting a little bit more detail as to her origins and the beginning of her reign and the Erdtree's birth. These intersecting stories make up the story of Shadow of the Erdtree, and while in future videos I will focus on each of these individually in a more granular detail, this lore video is meant to serve as a story summary or story explained video, where we tie it all together and try and create a greater narrative of this DLC. From Marika's original sin to Miquella's deification, this Elden Ring lore video will take you through the lands of Shadow and its history. But remember, if you like Elden Ring lore, then consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel, as I have hours of Elden Ring lore content for you to enjoy, and much more to come. In the first half of this video, I want to explain the lands of Shadow, and discuss the elements that made it what it is. For me, there are three historical events that make the lands of Shadow as unique as it is. Firstly, it is a land where the Crucible powers were once strong. Secondly, it was affected by the birth of the Erdtree and Scadutree, becoming the drain for all death. And thirdly, it was then shrouded by Marika and the Erdtree, displacing it from the material world. So let's start with the first one and these lands' relation to the Crucible. Prior to the rise of the Erdtree, these lands held a number of cultures, the Hornsent of Bellarat Tower and the ancient civilization of Ra being the two main examples. The Hornsent are a culture that seemingly thrived in the time of the Crucible, a culture where the veneration of things seen as taboo in the Golden Order era were seen as normal or even divine. Horns, beasts, and other elements that we associate with the Crucible. We learn of these lands' relationship with the Crucible from the aspect of Crucible bloom, which reads the following. Aspect of the Crucible discovered in the ancient ruins. In an age long past, before this land was enshrouded in shadow, the vitality of the Crucible flourished. Note that it says it was discovered in the ancient ruins of Ra, and indeed we do find this in Ra's ruins, surrounded by Miranda flowers. This lines up with what I've been seeing in my most recent videos about the Crucible, that the Crucible has existed far longer than I'd previously thought, that it wasn't just a precursor or first age of the Erdtree, it is an ancient power. In fact, I believe it may well have existed as long as life has existed. Taking a look at the item description for the other aspects of the Crucible incantations, which state it is the primordial source of all life that was once blended together. Primordial, of course, meaning first, or existing from the beginning. At the very least, this newest lore item, Bloom, tells us that it has been around since this ancient civilization, since ancient times. Indeed, in Ra, we find the Crucible Knight Devonia, and her helmet tells us why she is here, as it reads the following. Helmet worn by Devonia, longest serving of the Crucible Knights. It is said that Devonia quested in search of the Crucible's origin, and departed from the lands of the Erdtree alone, again suggesting that these lands, and even this ancient culture of Ra, have a history with the Crucible and its origins. The Crucible is an ancient force, and again I would suggest that even the tree on the stone tablet held by Elden John of the ancient civilization found in the lands between represents the Crucible. With that said, we now have a difficult question to answer. We know the Crucible was strong in these lands, and that Crucible Knight Devonia even travelled here to seek the origins of the Crucible. But where is it? The Erdtree supplanted the Crucible, and yet we can't see any trace of its remains. We know from the likes of the Godskin Noble Robe that the Crucible was the Erdtree's primordial form, and there's a good chance that it was just a tree itself that existed in these lands before being replaced by the Erdtree. Perhaps it is even one half of the knotted Skadu tree, with the Erdtree sapping its power in a sort of parasitic relationship. However, having thought deeply on the matter, I believe that the Crucible is something more esoteric than I previously believed. There is a certain shape that is important to the Hornsent, and that is the spiral. We see it in their spell sigil, we see it in their ornamentation, we see it in pillars, staircases, and we see it in the Near Elim itself, a spiral building that reaches up to the very gods. We know they favour it thanks to the description of the two-headed turtle talisman that tells us those of the tower favour these turtles because of its intertwining, spiralling necks. With that in mind, there are some interesting items that we should look at. Firstly, the spiral tree seal, which reads the following: Sacred seal of soiled amber engraved with a spiral tree design. The majesty of the White Tower, stretching to reach the gods, even inspired a secret faith in the invaders, the people of the Erdtree. Now, here we get confirmation that the Hornsent sigil is that of a spiral tree. However, interestingly, it then speaks no further about a tree, and in fact speaks on the spiral shape of Near Elim, and how it reaches the heavens. The important focus is put on the shape of a spiral in general, rather than a spiral tree specifically. What if the spiral tree, and the conception of the Crucible as a tree in general, is a symbolic representation of it, an analogous illustration of something that is intangible, and difficult to grasp for mortals, and thus they describe it as a tree? Hold that thought, and let us now read the description of Spira, the incantation, which reads the following: Wrap one's arms together and hold them up to the heavens, to summon a spiral light that erupts at enemies' feet. The spiral is a normalized crucible current that one day will form a column that stretches to the gods. Here it is straight up said that the spiral isn't literally a tree, rather it is a current of the crucible that is normalized and then stretched up into the form of a spiral. This is how the Hornsent see the Crucible, a spiral reaching up to the heavens, and thus they build a sacred tower that follows this current. And there is obviously something real about these beliefs, as at the top of Near Elim sits the Gate of Divinity, which is an artifact of real power. Perhaps it works because the Hornsent have correctly traced the power of the Crucible to a node in space where its power coalesces, where the Gate of Divinity now stands. Of course, like I said, the Crucible could well have been a tree, and I'm just getting too lost in the sauce. Indeed, one could see the Skadu tree as a spiral, given its knotted form, and I acknowledge that the Skadu tree could be what once was the Crucible, but is now one half of the Erdtree system. However, if this was the case, wouldn't the Crucible always be depicted in the same way? We know from Siluria's spear and helm that this depiction of a tree is also meant to represent the Crucible, and it is far different from the depiction of the spiral tree of the Hornsent. And so I suggest that the Crucible was an intangible power, and how it is viewed and depicted by different groups is essentially in the eye of the beholder. To the Hornsent it is a spiral tree that reaches into the heavens. To the Crucible Knights it is a wild tree, a source of strength and chaotic power. However, I do note that the Crucible tree set does also depict a spiral on the front, perhaps suggesting a shared heritage between the Crucible Knights and the Horn Knights. After all, they do have very similar movesets. Or perhaps it's just further confirmation that the Crucible was originally viewed as a spiral, it certainly is a nice detail, and a bit of connective tissue between the base game and the DLC. For now, I am satisfied with the information in the DLC about the Crucible. I didn't want it to be fully explained, but these new details bring us closer to understanding what the Crucible might have been. With that now said, I want to discuss the Hornsent more directly by talking about their culture, history, and their darker side. It is only in recent times, in the age of the Erdtree, that the influence of the Crucible waned, and in the lands between, Crucible elements were pushed to the fringes or outright purged. Omen had their horns cut or were imprisoned, the misbegotten were enslaved, and the Crucible Knights fell out of favour despite their heroic deeds. And effectively, the influence of the Crucible is very limited in the lands between. However, in some way the lands of Shadow are a bit of a time capsule of that earlier time. Life here is affected by the power of the Crucible, with all lifeforms sporting elements that we would associate with the Crucible and perhaps the Omen in the lands between. We see horns on bears, tortoise and humans alike, with even the ghostly spirits in this region having Omen-like horns. Beasthorn reads the following. The Crucible has a particularly strong influence on the beasts of the realm of Shadow, causing many to grow horns despite the characteristics of their species. Thus, it is not surprising that a humanoid horn-bearing people would arise in this land, the Hornsent of Bellerat. The Hornsent, of course, deserve their own in-depth video in the future, as they are an extremely rich culture with deep lore. But let us go over some of the basics because they are important to Marika's story, as well as the greater narrative of Shadow of the Erdtree. In our time, the Omen are termed as such because they are demonized. They don't fit into the cycle of the Erdtree, they aren't connected to it. We know from Dung Eater's quest that the curse of the Omen prevents souls from returning to the Erdtree. It is a bad thing to be an Omen at this time, given the Erdtree is centre of everything. However, we know from the Knot, Scale and Feather talisman that previously, in times past, being touched by the Crucible was a divine thing. This of course makes sense when you consider that the Crucible was once the nexus of all life, as the Erdtree is now. And now we have a culture who existed before the Erdtree, and of course their entire culture is centred around the Crucible. And as such, they have an entirely different belief system regarding horns and aspects of the Crucible. The Mottled Necklace explains the Hornsent's view on horns, as it reads, "Horns are sublime artifacts to the Hornsent, and their presence confirms the belief that they are a chosen people. Only the repeated sprouting of fresh horns can create a tangled horn, which is viewed as an irrefutable symbol of primacy." It really is fascinating. After these 2 years of only witnessing the oppression of the Crucible and the Omen, to discover a faction who clearly developed in the prime era of the Crucible, and have a culture built around venerating its elements and signs. The Hornsent's beliefs are more complex than this. As we discussed previously, the Hornsent see the Crucible as a force that can guide them upwards into the heavens, and to the gods, and thus it isn't a surprise that they also look to the sky and storms for their beliefs. The Horned Warriors of Tower Settlement claim descendant from Divine Bird Warriors, who we learn about via Ornis's ashes, which reads the following. Spirit of the Divine Bird Warrior, from who the Horned Warriors claim descent. Ornis succeeded in taming the Divine Bird, and made its wings his own as he soared through the sky. The Divine Bird's connection to the Crucible is reinforced directly by their incantation called Divine Bird's Feathers, which reads as follows. The Divine Bird Warriors, and indeed this technique, are said to bear a resemblance to the Golden Crucible. If the Divine Bird Warriors are the earliest version of their warrior class, perhaps it represents the formative elements of their religion, tracing the currents of the Crucible upwards into the sky, to a divine bird god, to where the storms rage, before they coalesced it into the spiral tree religion that they have now. Indeed, the wording of Divine Bird Feathers say this technique bears a resemblance to the Crucible. And given the Crucible can provide a practitioner with wings, as we see in both the Divine Bird Warriors and Crucible Knights, it wouldn't be too surprising that early Hornsent culture could view the Crucible as a divine bird. The power of the Crucible emits a golden light and can produce wings, thus the golden bird armour of the Divine Bird Warriors makes sense. It all leans into my argument that I made in the first chapter, that the Crucible is a kind of cosmic force that has been interpreted in many ways by different cultures. Later they would see it as a spiral tree reaching up into the heavens, but at this time they saw it manifest as a divine bird. These warrior practices evolved into the Horned Warriors. The Horned Warriors could in time become the Divine Beast Warriors, a division of Horned Warriors who could eventually become the Divine Beast Dancers. And this is something we know thanks to the Horned Warrior Ashes and the Divine Beast Warrior Armour, the latter of which reads the following: Armour of fated Horned Warriors, chosen to become Divine Beast Warriors, adorned with a lion's pelt. Among the Divine Beast Warriors, only those who truly excel at divine invocation become sculpted keepers, and are granted the honour of the lion dance. In turn, these Divine Beast Dancers clearly honour their Crucible and Divine Bird roots, evoking beast and horn imagery, but also invoking the power of storms within their dance, the storms of the sky. Again, the Hornsent will get their own video soon, but in short, this was a rich Crucible-born culture, one that in time would be usurped and destroyed by Marika's people, which is why their surviving members still bear a grudge against the Erdtree people to this day.
But understand, your kind are not forgiven. The Erdtree is my people's enemy, by Marika long betrayed, set aflame. I believe Miquella's apologies when he says our delivery will come, but never will I see your kind as worthy.
And I'm sure you can tell I absolutely love this part of the lore, and I cannot wait to do their own dedicated video. However, while we may mourn the destruction of this rich culture, they are not so unlike the Golden Order in their application of power. As Leda says,
That aside, man is by nature a creature of conquest, and in this regard the Tower folk are no different. They were never saints. They just happened to be on the losing side of a war.
Indeed, we do get some hints of the cruelty of the Hornsent regime, most keenly found in the Abyssal Woods, in their punishment of Sage Midra and his people. These lands are sealed by the Hornsent, and indeed we need to fight Jory, Senior Inquisitor, to even enter these lands. At Midra's manse, the executed remains of his people are displayed outside the front door, and Midra's fate is one worse than death. In his body is an Inquisitor's barbed staff, and we can learn the effect that it had on his body thanks to the item description of the Great Sword of Damnation, which reads the following: Golden greatsword that once pierced the body of Midra, master of the manse, used by the Hornsent in the execution of a damnation like no other. The barbs that enwreathe the blade pierce the victim from within, inflicting continuous wounds to assure eternal agony. This is a needlessly cruel weapon, and the Hornsent could have just executed Midra for dabbling with the Frenzied Flame. The Frenzied Flame is dangerous, and no wonder people want to contain it. However, what is the point of this execution aside from cruelty? Additionally, I like the extra bit of commentary that is found in the Ash of War for this weapon, Golden Crux, which reads, There is something of the Golden Order in the sight of those fixed upon this crux, commenting on the fact that the cruelty of this punishment is akin to the actions of the Golden Order. The Hornsent were not so innocent either, not so different in their application of power, a fact that becomes much clearer when we look at the Hornsent's treatment of the Shamans. The Shamans, who were Marika's people. One of the elements of the DLC stories that I was most interested in was Marika's, and her ascension to godhood, and thankfully we do get quite a few answer, some explicit and others that we have to read between the lines for. According to the flavour text of the DLC, this is the land that Marika first stepped foot in, and it is a land that has been obscured by the Erdtree. The reason that these lands are obscured and removed from the rest of the world is because of the Erdtree. We'll dig into the Erdtree soon, but let us focus on Queen Marika first of all, because as this flavour text promises, we do learn some of Queen Marika's early history. In exploring the lands of Shadow, you eventually come to a very special location, the village of the Shamans. As you arrive, you come to a meadow that is bathed in golden light, a light that contains the incantation known as Minor Erdtree. It reads the following: Secret incantation of Queen Marika. Only the kindness of gold without order. Creates a small illusory Erdtree. Marika bathed the village of her home in gold, knowing full well that there was no one to heal. I actually had this incantation in my inventory when I got to play the 3-hour preview ahead of launch, and back then I puzzled over its context, which I now have thanks to where we find it in the actual DLC, the village of Shamans. This must be Marika's hometown that she bathed in light. The fact that this was her home at one point is reinforced by the presence of her rune, and a statue of Marika that's tucked into a tree. In the lands between, Marika's people are known as the Numen, a fact we learn from the Numen's rune, which reads the following: The Numen are said to have come from outside the lands between, and are in fact of the same stock as Queen Marika herself. The Numen appearance preset reinforces the idea that these people came from another world, and that they were long-lived but seldom born. As I have discussed in many videos before, the original Japanese for the Numen is Marabito, and credit to Last Protagonist for first pointing this out to me. Marabito is a term that refers to a spiritual being that comes from a distant world or place, and for the past 2 years we have theorised where the Numen originally came from. Now, the flavour text states that the lands of Shadow are the realm in which Marika first set foot. Does this mean that her people, the Numen, are originally from here, and this is the other world that is being referred to? Or did they come from another world and first settled in this village that is now found in the lands of Shadow, and it was their unusual practices and lifespan that led to them being called shamans? I leave it up to you. Either way, this is a place where Marika and her people used to live before she became a god, and this is the closest we have come to understanding Marika's origins, and it makes sense that this town is one of the few regions that was not ravaged by Messmer's Crusade. It is his mother's hometown after all, likely seen as a sacred place to those in the know, which is why it is protected by a certain wing of the Black Keep, and is also well guarded by Erdtree sentinels. Now, this village is the village of the Shamans, and the term shaman is very interesting, but also relevant to the lore found in the DLC, because the term shaman is also used in reference to the lore behind the jars. Now, the warrior jars were a practice that we saw in the lands between. However, it seems like it originated here, in the lands of Shadow under the Hornsent. The main location of relevance to these jars is the optimistically named Bonnie Village, because it's here that we find the greater potentates, those who are responsible for preparing the gory innards of the jar people. We know that these potentates are Hornsent, and thus is a Hornsent practice, because the potentates wear the caterpillar mask, the same mask worn by the Hornsent of Miquella's companions, and indeed we do see omen horns coming through the top of the mask. We learn a little of this Hornsent practice via the knives that these potentates wield, the Bonnie Butchering Knife, which reads the following: Weapon of the greater potentates of Bonnie Village, an outsize butcher's cleaver used to dismember human bodies in the making of the great jars stored in the jails. Indeed, the very presence of these jars in the jails makes it clear that this was a punishment for criminals. In the Ballarat jail, we find a ghost begging not to be made into a jar, that he won't do it again, presumably referring to a crime he has committed and begging for any other punishment than being turned into a jar. But why this punishment? It is very cruel and specific, and it must have some relevance to the Hornsent people, and it was later just adopted by the Erdtree. Well, there is an interesting dialogue from a ghost found at the whipping shed that is nearby to Bonnie Village, and his lines imply that being put into a jar is considered nigh sainthood. Perhaps this process is a reflection of the Crucible. The Crucible is a place where life was once blended together, and perhaps the innards of these warrior pots, blended together flesh, is a reflection of that. We can but guess the relevance it has to the Hornsent. However, let us go back to that whipping shed and the ghost. Whipping is also a constituent part of the jar preparation process. Not only is the whipping shed next to Bonnie Village, but you can also find the tooth whip here, which reads the following: "Whip bestrewn with rotting, misshapen teeth, filthy and seething with disease. The teeth are embedded in the whip, and dose the victim with deadly poison upon each strike. As the wounds ripen, they grow inflamed and ooze pus. The flesh of shamans was said to meld harmoniously with others." So, a couple of things to comment on here. Firstly, we get confirmation that the jars do indeed contain multiple people, as flesh melds harmoniously together. But more importantly, it mentions that word again, shamans. Additionally, the ghost dialogue from the whipping shed is also directed at the shamans, while he whips them, telling them that this form of sainthood is the best that these can hope for. These shamans are disdained, persecuted, seen as lower than the Hornsent. As an aside, note the interesting branding that is found on the forehead of the jar innards. Is this a sort of brand that's reserved for shamans, to mark them out? Some kind of cruel punishment? I don't know, but I find this brand very interesting, and would welcome your thoughts in the comments below. There are additional more subtle ties to the shamans here at Bonnie Village. Nearby you can find a headless figure, who gives you the "Oh Mother" emote. This emote is used specifically to enter the village of shamans. The statue of Marika moves aside when you use this emote, and it's next to a note that reads, "Have mercy for the spirited away shamans." Taking all of this information together and reading between the lines, I think it is heavily implied that these shamans were persecuted by the Hornsent regime and turned into these jars. The minor Erdtree incantation implies that Marika might have been the last of her people here at least, for there was no one left to heal. Perhaps they were persecuted just because they were different, because they were from a different world, or perhaps it was because of their views. The word shaman is an interesting choice after all. It is usually a religious term for those who have special powers or knowledge of special rites in regards to a particular belief system or religion. Were Marika's people preaching a belief that threatened the Hornsent or contradicted their way of things? Given Marika would eventually usurp their world order, perhaps they were right to fear them. Returning to the minor Erdtree incantation, we do have to wonder if this secret incantation was one that she was able to cast prior to becoming a god. There is a tree found in Shaman Village, and within this tree is a statue of Queen Marika. What is the importance of this tree? Was this the first tree she created with her powers? A practice Erdtree perhaps? And was it these types of practices that had them branded as shamans and persecuted? As we discussed previously, I believe the Hornsent saw the Crucible as a metaphorical spiral tree. But what if Marika had visions of a true tree that would take its place, a physical manifestation of a new power in the world? And perhaps this was an idea that was planted in her mind by the Two Fingers. Count Ymir gives us some interesting dialogue, where he says that Queen Marika was indeed guided by the two fingers to do what she did.
That Marika and the fingers that guided her were unsound from the start.
And this shouldn't be too surprising, given as we know from Ranni's dialogue that Empyreans are chosen by two fingers.
I was once an Empyrean, of the demigods. Only I, Miquella, and Malenia could claim that title. Each of us was chosen by our own two fingers, as a candidate to succeed Queen Marika, to become the new god of the coming age, which is when I received Blythe, in the form of a vassal tailored for an Empyrean, but I would not acquiesce to the two fingers.
And Marika was once an Empyrean herself before becoming a god. She is named as such in Malekith's remembrance after all. However, the DLC is giving us some interesting detail here, as we now have a clear picture of how Marika likely came into contact with a two fingers, as very close to her village are the finger ruins of Deo. Again, these finger ruins are something I wish to discuss in a later video, but in short, these are the places from which the finger creepers and two fingers originate. Their very mother, the mother of all two fingers, is accessible through another finger ruin, that of Mir. Thus, it is almost a certainty that this was how Marika met a two fingers, and is how her path to godhood likely began. Indeed, there is the suggestion that it was the two fingers that told Marika how to create the Erdtree. When you blow into the hanging bell of the finger ruins, you are granted a talisman, the Crimson Seed Talisman +1, which reads the following. The Erdtree seed of this talisman was presumed to be an object of myth. This age-old artifact also depicts the two fingers, perhaps harking back to the birth of the Erdtree. This is possibly the most exciting lore item in the DLC for me personally, and it highly suggests that this seed of myth was the seed of the Erdtree itself, and that perhaps it was given to Marika by the two fingers, given they are depicted in this talisman as well. Elected as Empyrean and guided by the two fingers, Marika plotted against those who had oppressed her people. The age of the Crucible would be usurped by a new power, the Erdtree, and its goddess Marika. But how was she to achieve such a thing? Well, there is another item of significance found in the village of Shamans, in the hands of the Marika statue that sits beneath the aforementioned tree. This is the golden braid, and it reads the following. A braid of golden hair cut loose. Queen Marika's offering to the grandmother. What was her prayer, her wish, her confession? There is no one left to answer, and Marika never returned home again. So who was this grandmother that Marika visited and gave an offering to? Well, of course, this could just be a character we never met, an elder of the village of Shamans. However, I believe it was the Empyrean Grandam of the Hornsent. Empyrean Grandam being the full title given to her by the description of the Watchful Spirit. In my lore preview video, Vati left a comment where he said that he believes that she is not herself an Empyrean, rather a guiding figure to Empyreans, a grandmother to them. And if a young Marika, Empyrean herself, came to Grandam, then this would certainly make sense. Vati is right in that Grandam is an archaic term for grandmother, and thus it almost seems certain to me that this braid is a reference to her. Additionally, Grandam has a specific hatred of Marika specifically, calling her derogatory terms like a strumpet, alluding to specific knowledge of the seduction and betrayal that took place in the story trailer, and an intense hatred born of personal experience with Marika, but that's just my interpretation, of course. But why would she feel betrayed by Marika? Well, my speculation is that Marika got information from Grandam. Information about the Gate of Divinity.
The Tower of Shadow houses a divine gateway. A well-kept secret it was, but the gateway was once the birthplace of a god we know all too well.
The Gate of Divinity is what Marika used to become a god. This is what we see her do in the story trailer for Shadow of the Erdtree, and later Miquella would use it for the same purpose. As an aside, the bodies surrounding Einir Elim and the Gate of Divinity itself might look very familiar. They look like those found in the Eternal Cities, and thus we may begin to get some answers there as well. We know from the Noxian armor sets that they were attempting to create their own Lord of Night to bring about the Age of Stars. In the Eternal Cities and in Einir Elim, we see these bodies sort of cast or stuck to the buildings there, and thus I now speculate that the Nox were indeed trying to create their own divinity, perhaps trying to recreate the processes of the Gate of Divinity, but obviously to limited success. Remember, the Nox themselves are related to the Numen, and thus Marika, so perhaps they are aware of Marika's rise to power and of the Gate of Divinity. Ultimately, Marika managed to get close to this gate through subterfuge, likely killing the previous god or lord and taking their power, before passing through the gate herself and becoming a god. Then we return to the idea that the Erdtree was also created when Marika becomes a god. At the end of the day, Marika is always associated with the Erdtree. It is the foundations of her power. Perhaps she used the seed given to her by the Two Fingers. Either way, Miyazaki confirmed in an interview with Famitsu that these were the lands where the Golden Tree was born, as he said, "In fact, the Land of Shadows is the place where Marika became a god and the Golden Tree was born." Additionally, the story trailer says that this is the event in which gold arose, and with it shadow. The Erdtree and the Shadow Tree were created at this moment of her ascension as the two pillars of Queen Marika's rule. I find the Shadow Tree avatar's remembrance pretty poignant in highlighting the system of balance and duality that exists in Marika's order and between the Shadow Tree and Erdtree, as it reads the following. The Shadow Tree is the shadow of the Erdtree, born of dark notions that bear no sense of order, that twist and bend its stalk, rendering it brittle. If the Erdtree is the embodiment of order and life, then the Shadow Tree is the embodiment of death and disorder. It is the collection of everything that does not exist within the confines of that order, and as such, the Lands of Shadow is a mirror which absorbs all that grace denies. I think this idea of duality in Marika's rule extends beyond the Erdtree and Shadow Tree to Marika and Radahn themselves. I have always argued in past videos that Radahn has always existed as a part of Marika, that he was not ever his own person that was later merged with her. I have even suggested that he was born when Marika became a god, the Red King to her White Queen in the alchemical analogy. I now think that this is more likely than ever. The Erdtree was born with its shadow, and so does it not make sense that Marika would also reflect this, that she too would have her shadow born at the moment of the Erdtree's creation, Radahn her shadow, and other half in a system of cosmic balance and duality. Now that we've mentioned Radahn and his creation, I do want to talk about Messmer just briefly before we carry on talking about these systems of duality. There had been heavy-handed hints in the run-up to release that Messmer was another of Marika's demigod children, and it was more or less a certainty. And in-game this is now confirmed directly in numerous sources, like in the case of the Serpent Crest Shield, which explicitly names Messmer as son of Marika. Given his red hair and his name beginning with M, I still maintain he is likely a product of a Marika and Radahn mating, like Miquella and Malenia, but he predates them. Additionally, we now know something else about Messmer. Like Malenia and Miquella, he is a cursed being. He has within him an abyssal serpent, and we know from his remembrance that Marika, his mother, sealed this being by replacing his eye with an eye of grace. And this is actually what was in his eye, not a Drake Warrior's eye like I had initially thought when assessing the trailers. Indeed, you can see the top of Marika's rune in his eye if you look carefully, and it is very similar to the Iris of Grace item. Additionally, we know that this was an affliction that he was born with thanks to Gaius' remembrance, which says he and Messmer were born cursed. So like Miquella and Malenia, this is a birth defect essentially. However, as I said, I believe Messmer was born a lot earlier than Miquella and Malenia. Gaius' remembrance informs us that Gaius and Messmer were as older brothers to Radahn, meaning Messmer is older than Radahn, and thus Miquella and Malenia. I would also suggest that Messmer may well be Marika's firstborn, a prior union of Radahn and Marika, when she first became a god. Additionally, there is an oblique reference which suggests that Messmer is also the older brother of Malenia. Messmer's kindling reads the following: "The kindling that burned inside Messmer the Impaler, a dark thing, eaten away at by a wicked serpent, burns the sealing tree said to be found at the old raw ruins. Messmer, much like his younger sister, bore a vision of fire. This unnamed sister bore a vision of fire. Of black fire, perhaps." Again, FromSoftware are being coy with specifics here, but there's nothing in the DLC that contradicts that which I've always maintained, that Malenia is the Glomide Queen, with this reference being made to another daughter of Marika who saw fire. I'm once again solidified in my view that Malenia is the Glomide Queen, a daughter of Marika who was born with visions of fire. This means that she would be the younger sister of Messmer, and they both make up this previously unknown first generation of Marika's children, two children who are related to fire. And it makes sense that we've never heard about them until now. Both would be forgotten for different reasons. Malenia would rebel against her mother with the Godskin apostasy, and Messmer would be sealed away in the lands of shadow because of the serpent within him. Additionally, Malenia knows the minor Erdtree incantation, a secret incantation of Marika's early days, again potentially implying that Malenia was privy to her mother's earlier history and secrets. And I just want to give a shout out to viewer David Zhu, who made this point in my last preview video, that it's important how Malenia knows this secret incantation of Marika. So thanks, David. But we will talk more about Messmer in the next chapter. Let us return to the lands of shadow and the system of duality that was created when Marika became a god. Following the creation of the Erdtree and Shadowtree, the lands of shadow, lands with their own history already, would take on a new aspect. In the gravesite plains, there is a tower called the Tower of Suppression, and its plaque reads the following: "The very centre of the lands between, all manners of death wash up here, only to be suppressed." Death began to be drawn towards the lands of shadow under the Shadowtree, and we can see this everywhere with the great abundance of death. For example, there are the spirit graves found in gravesite plains and everywhere in the lands of shadow. We learn a little bit about these graves via the Gravebird armour, which reads the following: "Stone armour with a tinge of green. One of a set of armour pieces cast in the image of a gravebird." Gravebirds are ancient golems, created to guard the spirit graves, built where all manners of death ultimately drift. These lands are now where all death drifts, and this is why creatures and elements of death are so common here. The ghost flame dragons, tibia mariners, the stone coffin boats of Cerulean Coast, cemetery shades, those who live in death, and even Godwin surrogate bodies. This concept is further illustrated by Ghost Flame Breath, which you get from the Ghost Flame Dragons, and it reads the following: "The land of spirit graves is home to all manner of dead, and even the corpses of fallen dragons found their way there." So even the corpses of dead dragons are pulled here to these lands, which is why we find them in such great numbers. But why is death drawn here? Well, consider what the Erdtree and Shadowtree are. The Erdtree is the avatar of the current configuration of the Elden Ring. It is the nexus of all life. Marika's rune also seems to be the rune of life, as it looks like an inversion or opposite to the rune of death. Simply put, the lands of gold or of the Erdtree are the lands of life. What was removed from the Golden Order at its inception? The rune of death.
The rune of death goes by two names. The other is destined death, the forbidden shadow plucked from the Golden Order upon its creation.
As such, the denizens of the lands between are blessed, or cursed, depending on your view, with eternal life. Thus, does it not make sense that the Shadow Realm and Shadow of the Erdtree would be the receptacle of death, a place where it comes and is suppressed? Again, this will be the subject of a more in-depth standalone video in the future, but just bear in mind that the Shadow Realm is the way it is because of the Erdtree and the role that it plays in the system of cosmic balance that was created by Marika and the Erdtree. The removal of death has a consequence, and these lands are part of it. There is one final aspect of the Lands of Shadow that we of course need to talk about, and that is how it has become disconnected from the rest of the world and become its own dimension essentially. And in regards to the in-game item descriptions that refer to this event, we have very few. We have some of the aspects of the Crucible, which we looked at already, and we have an oblique reference in Messmer's Remembrance. So to try and understand this event, we have to read between the lines of these few item descriptions and look at what Miyazaki has said about this event. And so that is your warning that what follows is my speculation and explanation of how these lands were shrouded. Miyazaki said the following when talking about the Lands of Shadow. First of all, the setting of Shadow of the Erdtree is a brand new land. It's a brand new map separate from the lands between. It is a land that is overshadowed by the particular Shadow of the Erdtree as opposed to the Erdtree in the lands between, and it takes place, again, on an entirely separate, physically separate map. So it will involve a warp of sorts to get there. In terms of setting and themes, it technically occupies the same space as the lands between in the same universe, but due to something story related that we won't reveal today, this has become physically disconnected, and you'll travel to the Shadow of the Erdtree land as a separate place. And the flavour text for the DLC says the following: the Land of Shadow, a place obscured by the Erdtree. So this line in particular makes it clear that the Erdtree's influence is the reason that these Lands of Shadow are disconnected. And we get some tangential evidence that reinforces the fact that these lands once lay in the same physical dimension as the lands between, before the Erdtree existed. If it's the Erdtree that's obscuring these lands, that surely means that before the Erdtree existed, they were not obscured, and they existed in the same plane of existence that the lands between do. For example, there is Bale and his drakes, who roost at Jagged Peak in the Lands of Shadow. We learn from the Dragon Priestess that Bale betrayed Dragon Lord Placidusax, and he was wounded in return and then fled to Jagged Peak.
In a time long past, Bale turned upon the Dragon Lord. The foul traitor assailed our master and inflicted a grievous wound, only to make a hasty retreat.
I highly doubt that Bale would have been able to flee through the Veil, and thus he must have retreated from Fire Missoula to Jagged Peak when they were both in the same dimension, when these Lands of Shadow were in the same world as the lands between. But of course that's almost a given that the age of the dragons and the reign of Placidusax was something that came before the time of the Erdtree. And so, assuming that these lands once sat in the same world as the lands between, I did try to overlay the maps with one another to see where it could have fit, but I had no success. I couldn't get it to work. However, someone did. Reddit user Gilliam Yeager, and a massive shout out to you, Gilliam, overlaid it in a very compelling way. Firstly, look how snugly it fits up against Liurnia. Another thing that I think is really interesting is that the Scadutree would sit where Leyndell does now, next to its mirror, the Erdtree. One final thing I really like is that Jagged Peak would overlap with Dragon Barrow, where Greyol and her drakes roost now, perhaps a remnant of Bale's brood before they were separated by the Veil. And as I've argued in the past, the Bestial Sanctum that's also found in Dragon Barrow has the same architectural hallmarks as Fire Missoula, as if Fire Missoula itself sat here once. And so if Jagged Peak was next to Fire Missoula itself, it would make sense that Bale would flee here, and that his drakes would be left behind when he was torn with the mountain into the Lands of Shadow. I will leave it to you to decide whether you think there is supposed to be any map overlap, but I do find Gilliam's suggestion quite convincing. And initially when I was thinking about this idea of the Lands of Shadow being shrouded by the Erdtree, I initially assumed that this obscuring would have happened at the exact moment that the Skadu Tree and Erdtree were created. That again it was a consequence of this new cosmic order coming into being, and I think that is definitely a very real possibility and quite likely. Bearing in mind everything we have said about the Erdtree and Skadu Tree so far, we know that the entire cosmic order was upended when the Erdtree and Skadu Tree came about. The Skadu Tree made the Lands of Shadow essentially the well for all death, and it definitely makes a certain sense that as the Rune of Death was removed from the Elden Ring, so too were the Lands of Death removed from the lands between. And hearing me say that right now, it definitely is a very solid explanation as to how these lands became obscured. However, despite me being pretty happy with that explanation, there are some difficulties that we need to discuss here. The first being the issue of travelling here. Messmer brings a whole army here to wage a crusade, and yet we know it's very difficult to travel here. Miquella himself jumps through many hoops to be able to transport himself to the Lands of Shadow. In Vati's lore video that came out pre-DLC release, called The Lore of Elden Ring is Cursed, he made a suggestion that Miquella had purposefully allowed Mohg to capture and corrupt him with his Omen blood, so that it would strip him of grace and allow him entry into the Lands of Shadow. And it turns out that Vati was absolutely spot on with his guess, as we learn via Ansbach's storyline, where he says the following.
As if using Lord Mohg to gain entrance to the Land of Shadow were not enough, he plans to use his corpse as the vessel of his king consort.
We will talk more about the fate of Mohg and the resurrection of Radahn at the latter parts of this video, but in short, Ansbach claims that Miquella used Mohg in order to enter the realm of Shadow. Additionally, he further elaborates that he was charmed by Miquella.
Once, in an attempt to free Lord Mohg from his enchantment, I challenged tender Miquella, only to have my own heart rather artfully stolen.
Miquella's ability to bewitch is something we have known about for a while thanks to the description of the bewitching branch from the base game, though before now we've never really got any confirmation about anyone he has manipulated or bewitched. Ansbach dialogue implies that everything Mohg did regarding Miquella wasn't really Mohg's choice, that he was charmed by Miquella's power, and that indeed everything that Mohg did to Miquella was planned by Miquella, so that he was able to travel to the Lands of Shadow. We ourselves are now able to travel to the Lands of Shadow because of Miquella. We use his corpse as a sort of bridge between the two dimensions. My point is, it's very difficult even for a being as powerful as Miquella to travel there, and so how would Messmer's army travel to the Lands of Shadow if they were obscured since the birth of the Erdtree? Well, there are two explanations. The first is that there is just some power of Marika that allowed her to transport Messmer and his army there. Then there's the second explanation, that the Lands of Shadow were not shrouded initially, even when the Skadu Tree was born, and that later it was shrouded by Marika's direct actions, because she wanted things sealed away. She wanted the original sin, death, and her son Messmer sealed away. Again, I will leave this up to you to decide, given we have no direct evidence that argues either way. I personally believe that the birth of the Erdtree and Skadu Tree is what displaced the Lands of Shadow, and that we can explain away Messmer's ability to travel here by his mother's power, Marika was the god of this dual system after all. Whatever is the case, Marika did have things she wanted hidden away in the Lands of Shadow, away from the prying eyes of those in the Lands of Grace. Messmer's remembrance is a great source of information for this subject, as it reads the following. A malevolent snake writhed within Messmer, and so his very mother plucked out his eye and put in its place a seal of grace. Yet having done so, her fear compelled her to secret away her child within the realm of shadow, hidden away, keeping company with the original sin, and a hatred that would not be confined. First of all, it talks about another thing that Marika wants hidden, the original sin. This original sin has to be Marika's betrayal of the Hornsent and her ascension to godhood, the seduction and betrayal that we see in the story trailer. We do know that it was Marika's people who shrouded Einir Elim in shadow thanks to Grandam's dialogue.
Our lands were by thy kind set aflame, our tower by thy kind veiled in shadow.
Marika clearly wants to keep the source of her power and her sin locked away, keeping out any potential rivals from attaining godhood and burying the secrets of her past. Thus the sealing tree was set up and Einir Elim would become the Tower of Shadow. So that is one secret of Marika's that is buried in the Land of Shadows, but the other, as we have just read, is her son, Messmer. We know that it was on Queen Marika's orders that Messmer came to the Lands of Shadow. Leda says as much.
Long ago, Queen Marika commanded Sir Messmer to purge the Tower folk.
Messmer's armour set also tells us that he became this symbol of fear on his mother's command. He came here and perpetrated this crusade on her orders. And the ideological reasons for this crusade are quite clear in Messmer's dialogue and the dialogue of the likes of Quillen, who is a Fire Knight of Messmer as well. It's a dogma of grace purity. Those without the grace of gold will burn in Messmer's flame. This is why it's a crusade. It almost has a religious or sacred purpose to these crusaders. And so this is likely how the crusade was sold to Messmer and his followers, a war to purge those bereft of light. And as a result, Messmer would obliterate the Hornsent, erasing those that Marika had once betrayed. However, I believe that this was partially a ruse to trap Messmer in the Lands of Shadow, effectively killing two birds with one stone, trapping Messmer here, her son who she feared, whilst also allowing him to destroy her old enemies, effectively erasing her dark past. One detail that I really like about Messmer's forces is that while the Fire Knights are clearly voluntary and loyal to Messmer, the other rank and file members of his army are not so loyal in their beliefs. The helmet of Messmer's soldiers tells us that they were forced to wage this war, and that idea goes further when we read the Messmer soldier Spirit Ash, which reads the following. The soldiers belonged to the ignoble penal battalion, and were buried hidden from the Shadow Tree's sight. So Messmer's soldiers are made up of prisoners. The dregs of Erdtree society were forced into this war, and perhaps this is because Marika knew that she planned to have Messmer and his followers sealed away in the Shrouded Lands. Why not get rid of your prisoners while you are at it? Whether you agree with me that these lands were shrouded from the beginning, or that Marika shrouded them after Messmer came here in order to trap him here, the result is the same. Marika sent Messmer on a crusade, but then abandoned him here. There are two ghost dialogues in particular that reveal the moments in which Crusaders realised they were abandoned. There is one in Castle Ensis, where a soldier is begging Queen Marika to contact her son so that they can return home and end this crusade. And then there's one in Black Keep, who cannot believe the idea that they have been abandoned here by Queen Marika. Both suggest that the Crusaders believed that they would wage this war and then be allowed to return home to the lands between. Marika sent them on this crusade as a pretense, so that she could lock her son away. These soldiers were just unfortunate and caught in the schemes of gods. Let us now talk about the Crusade itself, given we've already discussed elements of it in this prior chapter. And I just want to speak a little on Messmer's actions and attitude towards this crusade. He was very thorough, of course. We see that in the story trailer when he is devastating Ballarat. And we can see that in the Lands of Shadow in general, given all the Hornsent towns are essentially destroyed. The Divine Beast Dancers, as we've discussed, were a massive part of Hornsent culture, but the remembrances tell us that they returned to battle when Messmer invaded. There are now only 2 left in the entire Lands of Shadow, one in Ballarat and one in Ra, and the Divine Beast Tornado item description tells us why this is the case, as it reads, "The majority of Divine Beasts were gored and hung upon Messmer's spears, then burned in his flame. Those who witnessed the deed likened it to a funeral pyre for the tower itself." Again, this is the act we witness in the story trailer, and the tyranny of Messmer's flame was pretty complete. He was of course accompanied by the brutal furnace golems. These automatons were brutal. The golem's visage says it depicts the fell god of the Hornsent. This is interesting as it mentions the fell god of fire, likely meaning the same fell god of the fire giants, but it's interpreted a different way by the Hornsent culture. But clearly this is a god that the Hornsent fear as well, and as such it has been fashioned onto these golems as a cruel scare tactic. Indeed, this is something the people of Leyndell have done before. The Omen Smirk mask of the Omen Killers is meant to represent the spirits which haunt the Omen's nightmares, and so it isn't surprising to see them pulling this same trick again, using the fears of their enemies against them. These golems must have been a horrifying sight, because you can see that their faces are actually animated. It isn't just a still representation of the fell god. And you see this most keenly when you hurt and stagger them. The visage usually has a stoic face, but when you knock them to the ground it has its mouth open in pain. The fires within these furnaces are no ordinary fires either. The tears that we can find within them tell us that the sap of the Skadu tree can be found within these golems. Additionally, the hefty furnace pot reads the following: "The furnace's flames burn away both body and soul." The aim was to destroy the Hornsent in every way possible, not just kill them. As for Messmer's involvement in this crusade, it seems as though he was doing it only because of his mother's commands. For example, Messmer's orb reads the following: "Messmer despised his own fire. Time and time again he hoped to rid himself of it, but ever did it burn." Messmer resents his fire, and yet he utilises it here at his mother's commands. With these remarks in mind, we should also consider the description of his armour set, which reads the following: "On his mother's wishes, Messmer made himself a symbol of fear, undertaking the cleansing crusade she desired." Messmer resents his mother, for with his dying words he curses Marika, his own mother. And no wonder. Consider the heinous acts he committed on her behalf, believing in the idea truly that those without grace needed to be exterminated, only to see that Marika's consort-elect in times later would be ourselves, a tarnished, a being without grace. So why then was he commanded to eviscerate a people that were without grace, if a graceless lord would eventually become Elden Lord? Add on to this that Messmer was essentially abandoned by his own mother, sailed away from the lands of the Erdtree. No wonder almost every statue of Marika found in the Lands of Shadow are beheaded. Both Messmer's soldiers and Messmer himself must have felt used and abandoned by Marika. And it wasn't only Messmer that was disdained. It seems as though those who joined Messmer were essentially abandoned and disdained by the people of the lands between, and this is the area of the lore that is quite difficult to square with everything we've discussed so far. We know that Marika commanded Messmer to do these things, but if that is the case, then how do we square that with the lore that we find in Black Knight Commander Andreas' ashes. These read the following. The Black Knights were the primary force of Messmer's army. Their first leader was Andreas, a man endowed with great strength and command over the powers of the Crucible. Though he remained a devout follower of Messmer after his flight from the Erdtree, he would rebel after learning of his liege's serpentine nature. So these ashes tell us that Messmer fled from the Erdtree, and for those following him, this was a test of loyalty because they were choosing Messmer over the Erdtree. Additionally, R'hllana had to give up her claims of royalty in order to follow him here. And finally, the headpiece for the Fire Knights has an interesting description, as it tells us that those from the Fire Knights were of Erdtree aristocracy, but when they joined Messmer they were shunned for this choice. But how does this all make sense when Marika ordered this crusade? Well, again, I have a speculative answer for you, and again, I don't think this is directly addressed anywhere in game, so we need to read between the lines here and draw our own conclusions. My first explanation is that Marika privately commanded Messmer to do this, but publicly she denounced the crusade. It is politics. She wanted this done and she wanted Messmer gone, and like a good son he agreed to these terms, and he took the flak for undertaking such a brutal crusade. Indeed, his armour set has a quote from him which reads, "Direct thy maledictions, thine ire, and thy grief towards me alone." Does this suggest that he willingly took up the position of a martyr for his mother, taking up all the negative press that would go along with it? It is the answer that I find most satisfying, and it reconciles these two opposing parts of the lore, both that Marika ordered this crusade, but also those that followed Messmer were spurned, essentially. There is another possibility that Messmer did the crusade, then returned home, and then he fled from the Erdtree and from his mother, and at that point they were viewed as traitors, and anyone who followed him had to give up their claims. But I leave it to you to decide and let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and how we can reconcile this part of the lore. Now let us ask the question of when this crusade took place. This is something I speculated on in my lore preview video, basing it on the threadbare information that I had from my 3 hours with the game, and in all honesty I feel I was more or less on the money there. There are numerous enemies and items that suggest that by the time this crusade took place, Erdtree rule had been in swing for a long time, and this crusade did not immediately follow Marika's ascension to godhood, and that the people of the Lands of Shadow, including the Hornsent, were allowed to live as they had been for quite a while. As a bit of background, we know that when the Erdtree arose it was resisted by everyone, as stated by the description of protection of the Erdtree, which reads the following. In the beginning everything was in opposition to the Erdtree, but through countless victories in war, it became the embodiment of order. Thus the Erdtree and its followers had to wage a war against anyone who resisted, a war of conquest, and the most significant conflict in this war was that against the Fire Giants. The sword memorial on the mountain top of the Giants states that it was upon the conclusion of this particular conflict that marked the true beginning of the age of the Erdtree. I think we have good visual evidence that Messmer's crusade took place after these initial wars of conquest, as the furnace golems seemed to bear the faces of the Fire Giants upon their legs. This is a known practice of the Erdtree people. The power of the Fire Giants left such a generational mark on their psyche that they constantly evoke the Fire Giant's image in order to project power. So it makes sense when setting out on this crusade that Messmer's army, when making furnace golems of fire, that they also associated it with their old enemies, the Fire Giants, whilst of course combining it with the fell god of the Hornsent in order to strike fear in their enemies. The main point being is that Messmer's crusade was not a part of those initial Erdtree conquest wars, and this means that the Lands of Shadow were essentially just left to their own devices, brought under the rule of Marika, yes, but they were not destroyed completely. A very lore significant item in the game is the gauntlets for the Crucible Knight armor set, which tells us that in time things associated with the Crucible were disdained, implying that the Crucible-based culture of the Hornsent was likely allowed to continue to exist under Erdtree rule for some time, like other elements of the Crucible would have been. Indeed, the festive Greece item description reads the following. The delightful festival is an old tradition, one old enough for the Erdtree to tacitly tolerate its endurance. And so the traditions of the Hornsent were allowed to continue under Erdtree rule for a time. And there are other examples of Erdtree and Shadow Realm culture blending together. For example, we can also find the Dueling Shield, which reads the following. An armament once used in ritual combat performed to honour the Erdtree, a custom that has somehow remained within the realm of Shadow. In summary, the Hornsent were not obliterated initially, and like other elements of the Crucible, they were tolerated for a time under the Erdtree's rule. With that said, we also get evidence of other events that happened before Messmer's Crusade took place, thus allowing us to place it more precisely on the timeline. One of the main pieces of evidence that I reviewed in my preview video was the presence of R'hllana and the Carians and her relationship to Messmer. R'hllana is a loyal retainer of Messmer's, and she gave up all of her claims in order to join him, and this is something we learn about from her remembrance, which reads the following. Once a Carian princess, R'hllana disavowed her birthright and chose to stand at Messmer's side, knowing full well that not even the brilliance of the moon could grant him succour. Before long, she became known as the Sword of Messmer. R'hllana is the sister of Rennala, a fact we learn of from her helmet, which reads, Rennala, head of the royal family of Caria, was said to have given her younger sister, who renounced her lineage to chase after Messmer, a gift of lustrous black hair. The fact Rennala gave R'hllana a gift on her departure seems as though Rennala is giving her blessing to her sister to follow Messmer. This would never have happened prior to Rennala's marriage to Radahn, the pact that joined the houses of the moon and the tree together. Prior to this, Rennala led 2 wars against the Erdtree, the Wars of Liurnia, and thus she would have been very unlikely to allow her younger sister to go with a demigod of Erdtree lineage in the time before her marriage to Radahn, meaning this crusade took place after Rennala's marriage to Radahn. Additionally, there is even more concrete evidence that this crusade took place after Rennala's marriage to Radahn, and that is the presence of the virgin abductors found at the Fort of Reprimand in the Lands of Shadow, a vile place clearly constructed by Messmer's forces to administer punishment, execution, and torture. The virgin abductors are creations of Rykard, an evolution of his inquisitors, and used by him to abduct subjects to Volcano Manor. Presumably this means that Rykard granted his half-brother these tools, and so the crusade must have taken place after Rykard was born, Rykard being a child of Rennala and Radahn. Indeed, there is further corroborating evidence, as Messmer seemingly had a relationship with another of Rennala's children with Radahn, Radahn. We learn this via Gaius's remembrance, which tells us Messmer was an older brother to Radahn, the young lion. Gaius and Messmer were both senior to Radahn and were both as brothers to him, again meaning Messmer's crusade must have been well after Radahn, Rykard and Ranni were born. Gaius also came here to be Messmer's crusade commander, and yet his armour tells us that he was also the senior disciple of the same Alabaster Lord that trained Radahn, again meaning that Radahn's tutelage under the Alabaster Lord of Sellia must have happened before Messmer's crusade, given that Gaius was taught by the same lord at the same time as Radahn before he would lead Messmer's armies. This was quite a bit into Radahn's life, into his young adulthood at least. We learn from Radahn's new swords that can be made from his remembrance that the young Radahn we fight at the end of the DLC is a Radahn prior to the Star Scourge conflict, meaning he was around this age when Gaius was a disciple alongside him. As a note, this is clearly the age Radahn was when Miquella really took note of him for his gallant nature and strength, and it's an interesting insight into the relative ages of the different generations of demigods, but that's something we will discuss in another video. Additionally, there's the fact that Messmer knows what a Tarnished is.
That tarnished, it seemeth.
The Tarnished are a people that came into existence following the banishment of Godfrey and his warriors, as this was the point when they were all stripped of grace. They were tarnished. So if Messmer knows what a Tarnished is, he must have still been in the lands of the Erdtree when Godfrey and the Tarnished were banished from the lands between. Again, placing this even further up the timeline, likely at a point when Radahn had married Marika and abandoned Rennala, following Godfrey's departure. I think that's all we can say with certainty, however, that this crusade took place after Godfrey's banishment and during Radagon's reign, at which point we don't really know. This all makes sense, however, as this is when Golden Order fundamentalism would have begun to take hold, and thus the people of the capital would have become less tolerant of those without grace, of those of the Crucible, and therefore a crusade makes sense in this time period. It makes sense that this is somewhat contemporary with the treatment of the Omen. The Omen killers are also found within Messmer's crusade. You can find them at the Fort of Reprimand, and it would make sense that they would relish the opportunity to join the crusade and exterminate an entire society of Crucible-touched peoples. So Messmer obliterated the Hornsent people in a time before the Shattering, and would be sealed away there by his mother. But we know what happened later. Marika's order would come crumbling down when she shattered the Elden Ring, and the Shattering War would break out. The mad taint of the strength of the great runes that were claimed by the demigods would drive them to vie for supremacy, and yet no clear victor arose to claim the mantle of lordship. Yet among the demigods were also 3 Empyreans, potential candidates for new godhood: Ranni, Miquella and Malenia, who all had the potential to entirely supplant Marika's order, not just succeed as lord. And we do see this potential in all 3 of them. Malenia is seeded with the Scarlet Rot by an outer god, and has the Goddess of Rot within her, just waiting to bloom and bring around the Age and Order of Rot. Ranni has taken steps to bring about the Age of Stars. Guided by the Dark Moon, she has shed her Empyrean flesh in order to free herself from the old order, and thus she can create something new, a new order. And now, of course, we see the potential of the Empyrean Miquella realised in the DLC, when he does return as a god, the god of kindness, vowing to make a more gentle world. But let's talk about his plan. Simply put, Miquella is seeking the Gate of Divinity, so like his mother, he can use it to become a god. In order to reach the Lands of Shadow, however, he has to take some interesting action. As we discussed earlier, he charmed and used Mohg in order to enter these lands. Mohg's blood corrupted his grace-given body, allowing Miquella to enter the Lands of Shadow. Ansbach greatly resents this manipulation of his lord, especially when he later finds out what has been done with Mohg's corpse, which has been taken after your fight with Mohg and delivered to kindly Miquella. This is why that even if you mess up every other NPC questline, a sanguine noble will join you for the final fight against Leda. The Mohgwyn dynasty demands blood for the humiliation and desecration of their lord, who is misled by the bewitching Miquella. Arriving in the Lands of Shadow, Miquella begins to leave crosses behind, and as you inspect them and words coalesce, you realise that these crosses are parts of Miquella's very flesh. His eye, his arm, his heart are all left on the ground. Miquella is discarding his Empyrean flesh as he travels across these lands. Not only this, but he discards something else of his other half, St. Trina. This is indeed the scene shown to us in the trailer, when St. Trina falls down a hole, and we now know that this hole is the fissure. And of course this now confirms what myself and others have been saying for years. Saint Trina is the other half of Miquella, likely how Radahn is Marika's. We find a cross at Carillion Coast and one at the fissure that both suggest Miquella is abandoning Saint Trina because she essentially represents love and attachment, and he doesn't want to be swayed from his path by her. Indeed, Saint Trina doesn't agree with Miquella's decision to become a god, encouraging you to kill him, as she feels as though godhood would be a trap for Miquella, and death is actually preferable. This is why Tollier will join you in the final fight against Leda and Miquella if you complete his quest. He is honouring Saint Trina's wishes to kill Miquella. Ranni shed her Empyrean flesh so that she could become a god of a new order, detached from the shackles of the Greater Will and the Erdtree. Miquella is also shedding his Empyrean flesh and everything of himself that connects him to his lineage, so that he may become a god that is unconnected to his mother's order and heritage.
I can hardly believe it. He's divested himself of his very eye. Tender Miquella's eye is no mere morsel of flesh. It is a vessel of soaring grace, proof of his Empyrean lineage. I wonder, does Miquella the Kind intend to sever his very birthright, his fate as a child of the Erdtree?
Miquella also seems to have revealed his intentions to the Hornsent. The Hornsent tells us that Miquella told him that he wishes to detach himself from his mother's original sin, and this is why he is stripping himself of his Empyrean flesh, and thus he can become a new god, unburdened by his heritage.
Miquella has said as much himself. He wishes now to throw it all away. He says the act, though undoubtedly painful, will sear clean the Erdtree's wanton sin.
He is cleansing himself of his mother's sins. Indeed, this is also a similar conclusion that Ansbach makes upon reviewing Miquella's path towards the Tower of Shadow, and his discarding of flesh and Saint Trina.
Righteous Tarnished, I have reasoned through my findings concerning kind Miquella's intentions, why he is here. The full picture is yet to coalesce, but we do know that he is bound for the Tower of Shadow, and that is where he intends to rise to true godhood. The Tower of Shadow houses a divine gateway. A well-kept secret it was, but the gateway was once the birthplace of a god we know all too well.
Miquella will become a god, but one that is not tied to the Erdtree, and eventually he destroys and discards his great rune, shedding the last connection to the Elden Ring and the Old Order. When he steps through the gates of divinity, he will do so on his own terms. His godhood would not be tainted by the sins of his mother. However, this is only one part of his plan. As those familiar with the lore will know, a order requires both a god and a lord consort. Placiduous Sax was the lord consort in his time. Godfrey, Radahn, and potentially us, the Tarnished, are consort to Queen Marika. In the specimen storeroom, we find a note called Secret Rite Scroll, which contains information for those who wish to use the Divine Gateway. It reads the following: few can decipher the scroll, which describes the secret rite of the Divine Gateway, said to be found at the Tower of Shadow. A lord will usher in a god's return, and the lord's soul will require a vessel. A lord is needed to usher in a god's return. A lord is required for Miquella's plans to reach fruition, and Miquella does have a particular lord in mind: Radahn. One of Miquella's companions is Freya. She tells us that she was once a Redmane soldier that fought alongside Radahn, In fact, her golden lion shield tells us that she was a part of Radahn's personal guard. Therefore, given her loyalty to Radahn, it makes sense that she is interested in something Miquella said about Radahn, that Miquella once made a vow to Radahn.
Kindly Miquella spoke of the vow he once made with General Radahn, and it is here the vow shall be honored. I am a Redmane. I must know the nature of the vow.
And we see this vow revealed to us in the final cinematic of the game.
Lord brother, I'm going to be a god. If we honor our part of the vow, promise me you'll be my consort. I'll make the world a gentler place.
When Miquella ascended to godhood, he made a vow that Radahn would be his lord, and this was because of all the qualities that Miquella saw in Radahn during his youth. We learn of this via Miquella and Radahn's remembrance, which reads the following. In their childhood, Miquella saw in Radahn a lord, his strength and his kindness, that stood in stark contrast with their afflicted selves. And so Miquella made his heartfelt wish, that Radahn would one day be his king consort. And this is why we needed to kill both Radahn and Mohg prior to the DLC. Miquella needs both of these elements in place before his plan can come to fruition. He needed Radahn's soul freed, and he needed Mohg's body in order to combine the two. When we win at the Festival of Radahn, we kill Radahn's original body and free his soul, but this soul now needs a vessel, and that's where Mohg's corpse comes in.
As if using Lord Mohg to gain entrance to the land of shadow were not enough, he plans to use his corpse as the vessel of his king consort. He has forsaken Lord Mohg's soul. He desires only his empty shell. It beggars belief, but I'm afraid tender Miquella fails to grasp the humiliation implied by this act. One thing is certain. My dear lord deserved better.
Radahn's soul is inserted into Mohg's body, and he is reborn as he was in his youth, with his swords telling us that this is Radahn pre-Star Scourge conflict, Prime Radahn. But there are some elements of Mohg remaining in this new vessel. Radahn can now use Formless Mother incantations, clearly a latent effect of Mohg's powers manifesting in this new Radahn. One can't help but feel sorry for Mohg in the way his body is being desecrated. Indeed, if you complete Ansbach's questline, he will join you in the final fight, admitting that it's nice to see Radahn again, but he has essentially commandeered the Lord of Blood's body, a humiliation and desecration, and Ansbach is here to give Mohg some dignity in death, given he was once the commander of the Blood Knights of Mohg. And this is a part of the lore that I really like. Mohg was one of my favourite bosses in the original game, but he was considered a bit of a joke in-game, with the likes of Gideon scoffing at Mohg's ambitions, writing him off as a deluded idiot. However, we now know that it was Miquella that charmed him into behaving the way that he did. Indeed, Ansbach isn't even annoyed that we killed Mohg when we admit this to him. He sees that as an honourable end, but he's annoyed that Mohg was made a fool of by Miquella. I think we also do see the honour of the Mohgwyn dynasty in this DLC. Ansbach is an honourable man who just wants to give his liege lord some dignity in death. And if he is not there, another sanguine noble will serve in his place when you face Leda. Conversely, Freya, a warrior loyal to Radahn, supports Miquella's plan because he's bringing back her lord essentially, and so she and Ansbach end up on different sides of the final battle.
Yes, of course, I see. As the Festival of War concluded, General Radahn's soul met an honorable end, but kindly Miquella wishes to revive it, which is fine by me. I know it would pain old Jeren, but war has always suited General Radahn best, and certainly far more than any honorable death. Endless war to invigorate the soul, as befits General Radahn, the great lion.
But this brings us to a point of lore that we need to explain, and I'm sure some people will want the answer to this. Why does Malenia fight Radahn if Miquella wanted him for his consort, when Malenia and Miquella have such a tight bond and she is fiercely loyal to him? Well, I do have an explanation for you, and that is that this was an agreed part of the plan between Malenia and Miquella, that Malenia was meant to kill Radahn at Ionia so that Miquella could resurrect Radahn as his new lord. So let me explain this. In the remembrance of Miquella and Radahn, we learn that this was Miquella's heartfelt wish, but was it Radahn's? We see Miquella making the vow to Radahn in the memory cinematic, but what did Radahn think of this? We never hear Radahn's thoughts on becoming Miquella's consort. Everything we know about Radahn in fact suggests that he would rather have upheld the old order, becoming the Elden Lord of the current order, rather than replacing it with Miquella. His armour set celebrates the past two Elden Lords, his father Radahn and Godfrey, first Elden Lord. His father being represented by the red mane, and Godfrey being represented by the lion that's on his armour. Radahn did a great video on Radahn's heroic concept, which I will link below, but in short, Radahn describes how Radahn's themes are that of stagnation or continuity. Not only does he venerate the past, but he's unwilling to let go of things. In a positive sense, this means he is loyal to his tiny horse who he outgrew and learned gravity magic for so he could literally still ride this. And it also means that his men are some of the most fiercely loyal out of all the demigods, because Radahn himself is a loyal man. However, one need only look at the horse situation and see how ridiculous it is, to see that this is a man who is unwilling to let go of his past. Coupled with his veneration of the past Elden Lords, and the fact he has held fate in stasis, makes it clear that Radahn is a lord of status quo, stagnation, or stasis. As such, my suggestion is that Radahn was likely unwilling to become Miquella's consort if he was even consulted at all. And we now know that Miquella is not above manipulating other demigods for his own ends, such as he did with Mohg. Is it therefore possible that he commanded Malenia, his blade, to kill Radahn so that he could resurrect Radahn in a more pliable, controllable form? This is my belief, and that the Radahn who is returned at the end of the DLC is essentially enthralled to Miquella, and so Radahn's death at the hands of Malenia was part of the plan. Indeed, this is more or less confirmed by the description of Radahn's new armour set, which reads the following: "When Malenia, blade of Miquella, let the rockflower blossom in Ionia, Radahn heard a murmur in his ear. Miquella awaits thee, O promised consort." To me, this is saying that in the moment where Malenia attacked Radahn with the Scarlet Rot, something we saw in the story trailer for the base game, she leant in and whispered in his ear that Miquella awaits Radahn. She's doing this on Miquella's order. She is his blade after all. They wanted Radahn to die here so that he could be resurrected and controlled by Miquella as his new lord consort. Of course, it didn't go exactly to plan. Malenia didn't kill Radahn outright, and we finished the job. Hence why when we enter the boss arena with Miquella, he celebrates us as the victor of the festival, alongside his loyal blade Leda.
My loyal blade, and champion of the festival. Both your deeds will ever be praised in song. Now, the vow will be honored, and my lord brother's soul will return, so that he may be my consort.
Because we played an integral part in finally allowing his plans to come to fruition. Miquella promises to bring about a kinder, gentler age, so why do we have to fight him? Well, I actually really like this detail and the way they do it in the DLC. After defeating Messmer, you might notice that the guidance of grace is back. No longer are you following in Miquella's footstep. Once again, grace, the Erdtree and Marika are guiding you to destroy a rival to their current order. As Leda says in her fight dialogue,
It was never kindly Miquella, was it? The Erdtree was leading you all along, so that you might ascend to lordship. Why come to these lands to begin with? I suppose it must be what His Eminence, or perhaps the Erdtree desired all along. The clashing of the favored lords, such that one would prevail. So be it. If you insist upon facing Miquella the Kind, then I will run you through whoever you might be. Don't tarry now.
Additionally, the Hornsent refers to you as Lord of Marika, Lord of the Erdtree. It was the Erdtree that guided you here. You are the Lord-elect of the Erdtree Order, and thus this new god and lord are rivals. It is a battle between the old lord and the new one. This confrontation is necessary and needed so the next age can come about, one way or the other. Leda's dialogue also suggests that His Eminence wanted this as well, that Miquella wanted this. We must be removed in order for Miquella to succeed. If he breaks us, he breaks Marika's last chance. If you do want to roleplay someone who agrees with Miquella and you want him to win, I would suggest you let him grab attack you twice in stage 2 of the final fight. For if you do, you will be charmed by the bewitching powers of Miquella, and you will kneel before him with your heart stolen. But yeah, not gonna lie, I like being the Erdtree's chosen champion, and destroying a god in the ultimate dynastic conflict. One further obstacle to your ascendancy removed, with little left to deny your right to the Elden Throne. Or for those who support Ranni, Miquella is also a rival to her order as well. So just bear that in mind that no matter which of the endings you choose in the base game, Miquella must be destroyed. So that is the story of Shadow of the Erdtree. We learn of the past, how Marika became a god, and the civilization she usurped. We learn of her accursed son Messmer, and how he was sealed away alongside the Gate of Divinity. We learn how Miquella sought to shed himself of his heritage, of the sins of his mother, and bring about a kinder age, delivering the Hornsent from their ruin, and ending the tyranny of the Erdtree. But there can be only one Lord, and guided by grace, we end the Unalloyed's ascension before it truly begins. We prove ourselves against the greatest warrior of an age, and we give Mohg some dignity in his rest. Thus, when we return to the lands between, it can no longer be denied that we are the true Lord of the next age. That is my take on the general story, guys. Like I said at the onset of this video, each of these main story elements do have far more details that I didn't go into, which I'll cover in more dedicated videos in the near future. However, I wanted to do a video that covered the main story, as I loved the story thread of Shadow of the Erdtree. Anyway, let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and which subjects you'd like me to discuss next. But until next time guys, I will see you in the Shadow of the Erdtree. Take care, and have a wonderful evening.